Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be back at Roger Williams. It's always one of the more interesting conversations I ever experience, and this, in a way, has been, after yesterday, a very tough act to follow, a very heavy discussion, and it compelled me to make some significant adjustments to my presentation that I hope will contribute to the extension of this conversation in interesting ways. The first thing I've added that I hope will be useful in this dialogue was triggered by the mention of metaphor, the problem of metaphor, the role of inscriptions and monuments, and several other things that I realized was an excellent way to get to the discussion that I really want to have, and that is something that's been suggested in several presentations yesterday, and that is the role of the human body, the platform of all experience, and how that is useful in consideration of how we do what we do in the design of physical manifestations of big ideas, whether it's monuments or something else. The challenge that was put before us yesterday was how to move beyond the passive character of memorializing something that happened in the past. And of course that is anything but passive. We know that you can't do anything. We were reminded yesterday that just to brush your teeth you need to have memory. Without the recollection of the past, you are incapable of doing anything. But I hope by the end of this to share with you something that Manuel Delgado has taught me about in the past few years, about how architecture can actually be a proactive instrument for doing some of the things that were suggested, especially by Julian yesterday. So the first stop along this path is the writing of Nelson Goodman, not an architect, a philosopher. In 1988, he published an essay called How Buildings Mean. And after studying for decades French philosophers trying to grapple with one small part or another small part of this question, I come back to Nelson Goodman as a very clear thinker who is capable of presenting these issues in a way that my students and I can deal with on a very pragmatic level. So basically it boils down to four. He identifies four mechanisms of how buildings mean, and I'm starting in the wrong place, aren't I? Don't look. Okay. So the first way, and he uses the Lincoln Memorial usefully enough for our discussion, as the demonstration of how buildings mean. The first way buildings mean is very explicitly through denotation. His word is denotation. We use language to literally say what we mean. And to inscribe them in buildings, we literally have the buildings convey through language what it means. So the Gettysburg Address and other inscriptions in the Lincoln Memorial get straight to a very direct denotation of meaning. The second way is through exemplification. And exemplification is the big one. This is what we teach our students. This is what we mean when we refer to experience of space and place. And it's the one that I think that many of us would argue is the primary and most powerful operation of generating meaning. And it occurs at multiple scales, including the scale of the city. Anyone arriving at this place would be struck by the importance of this larger-than-life figure sitting on his throne in this impressively scaled building. And so more on this later, because this is the one that has the most to do with the human body and our experience. The third one is metaphor. There are whole systems of meaning that are conveyed through our educational systems, through the conveyance of cultural meanings. From the time we're born to the time we die, we are taking in newer versions and negotiating new versions of cultural meanings. And the negotiation of cultural meaning is one of the big things we do as a society, whether we're consuming advertising, producing stories, national identities, ethnic identities. Identity constructions are often metaphorical in nature because meanings are often constructed in relationship to prior meanings, and metaphor is a powerful way to do that. We know what a Greek column means through our cultural mechanisms. And then finally, and this is the one that takes us away from architecture and gives us a sense of humility in the face of human events, especially in things that we talked about yesterday. Things happen in places independent of any intentions of designers or clients or funders or anybody. Things happen and meanings shift because of the events of history. And so all of these mechanisms are clearly demonstrated in Nelson Goodman's use of the Lincoln Memorial, and becomes the basis for further extensions of meanings where architecture becomes a powerful vehicle for conveying meanings of a society, whether it's national interest or not. I want to extend for a moment some of these ideas by one more idea. Well, first of all, just to reinforce this, the World Trade Center towers meant different things at different times. And for much of their existence, they represented the hubris of power to those who lamented their impact on Lower Manhattan. But of course, that will not be the meaning that is extended forward in time. The important addition to Nelson Goodman, and here this is starting down the path of his second method of meaning construction, which is exemplification, what he calls exemplification, but what we have a much larger, richer language, I believe, to describe. But I think it's worth mentioning the power of place itself, that the pilgrimage networks of the early Christian Europe, what drove the pilgrims to visit places was not simply the indulgences they would be granted as a reward for their suffering, but to stand in the presence of the actual physical reality of the relic that is being visited. It points to the power of a concept that we call Presencia, that by simply having the actual relic in our presence, somehow there's an exchange of molecules, that we breathe the air and shed the skin cells, and there's something about the physical presence that has a power that in a way defies description linguistically, but through our actions we exemplify how important it is to be actually physically present. Some of us have doubts about online learning courses in part because of this, but certainly the power of actually being in a place is something that is not lost on many of us. And some would argue, have argued, that you shouldn't present something in lecture that you haven't actually experienced physically in a spatial experience, in part because of the importance of not just consuming these places visually and remotely or through narrative descriptions, but in the body. Now this is where we make a leap to to that one of those French people that I said we didn't need to talk about. But Pierre Bourdieu actually presents a very useful set of ideas when we talk about the human body, and very much adds to this second category of Nelson Goodman, of exemplification. In his anthropological research in North Africa, he points out the importance of the physical environment, the form of the physical environment. And this was the point of origin of his concept of the word that Renata used about an hour and a half ago, habitus. The power of the structure of a physical space to have on our mental constructions. So the physical space is not just something out there on its own, independent of our embodied mind. It actually, there is a dialogue, there's a constant dialogue between our mental structures and the physical structures. And the phenomenon that he observed that led him to articulate this idea is the networks of pathways in the village of Kabylia in the highlands of the mountains of colonial Algeria, where he noticed that the women stayed in the house until the men would go to the fields, and it was only after the men had left the village that the women would go to collect water. But when the women needed to collect water when the men were in the village, it resulted in a secondary network of back alleyways, which were the appropriate paths for the women to take. And the collection of water was something that occupied a great deal of time and effort. And so it was actually a significant portion of the human labor of the village. And the physical structure of the village was, in a way, the instrument that created this sense of the gender definition and these cultural practices of the society of the village. And it was really this example that led him to speculate on this connection between the structure of physical space and our mental structures that we carry around with us. And so habitus is the word that is used to refer to those mental, physical, the relationship between mental, physical structures. And it becomes quite useful in considering the notions of how these operations continue in the present, where the bodily experience of architecture is not an insignificant factor in how buildings mean, and getting back to this, the four-part structure, the categorization by Nelson Goodman. And from here we go to the architectural photography of Iwan Baan. You may or may not have heard of Iwan Baan, a Dutch photographer, but you have seen his photos. There is no well-known architect today who has not had his work presented through the medium of Iwan Baan's vision and the lens of his camera. But Iwan Baan has become famous because of, or in spite of, you can decide for yourself, the breaking of two significant taboos of architectural culture. The first taboo that he breaks is that he thinks of himself as a portrait photographer. He takes photographs of people, and he credits as his influence famous portrait photographers much more often than any architectural photographers. And so his work focuses on people in the rarefied spaces of architectural creation. The second taboo he breaks is he does not frame the idealized objects of architecture tightly. He allows the urban space of the city to frame the architecture that he's looking at. So with that as a prologue, I'm going to take us to two examples, and I told Dylan I wouldn't repeat what I presented to his class, but I changed my mind. When I found myself working with the king of Java in the palace in central Java, one of the first things I noticed is the buildings themselves were not very preservation worthy. They were quite decrepit, but what made the palace very special is the shock that I got when I arrived to find that there was actually a king and a court and princes and queens and a set of religious practices that still charged this architecture to the present day as if it were several centuries ago. And so the continuity of these practices were startling to me. The other thing that startled me is the imminent implementation of a colonial Williamsburg approach to the preservation of this palace, where the royal family and all those living bodies that were enervating the spaces, the authentic religious practices that continued to the present, were about to be displaced as the royal family was invited to move out to the gated community suburbs so that the palace could be properly preserved following the guidelines established by colonial Williamsburg, and the actors would replace the royal family and to a more effective entertainment value of the tourist. And shopping malls would occupy the space of the former Dutch fortress, etc. You can imagine the rest. And so I was in the right place at the right time to help develop an alternative model based on not so much the tourist value, not so much the value of the buildings, but the value of the living practices of the people that continue to energize the palace to the present day, I'm happy to say. And so it was the ability to transform found objects and cultural importations from Europe, where this Baroque Dutch carriage became Kiai Garuda Kencana, the sacred conveyance of the gods of the Hindu Javanese cosmology, and the incorporation of the Baroque architecture of the palace, the brass band, the fez, the Dutch tuxedo coats with the tails clipped to accommodate the Javanese sword and the batik skirt. All of these things were Javanized. One of the most important verbs of Javanese language and culture refers to the process of incorporation and legitimization of these cultural artifacts, including the mosque, which developed out of the Hindu architecture. And here we have the Javanese mosque, the commemoration of Muhammad's ascension, using the Hindu linga yoni symbols of these offerings in a hybrid formation that continues to have meaning such that the young men rip it to pieces and take it home. I'm going to move quickly through the role of the palace as an instrument of restoring the balance between heaven and earth. The water used to wash the buildings is greedily gathered up by the women to take back home and spread on their children if they ever get sick. The ritual circumambulation of the palace on the Javanese New Year to restore the balance between heaven and earth. And it strikes a comparison not so much to colonial Williamsburg, where there's the resurrection of heritage, even if you have to kill it in order to resurrect it. It's more likely to be compared, or more usefully compared, to the Ise Shrine, where the actual living culture of its reconstruction in a cyclical pattern every several decades is the building itself. The material is not old. It is constantly renewed. It is the living tradition and culture of the renewal that is of value, and which brought us to the embodied value of the king, where the king is the source of legitimacy. He's also a human being. He hangs out in the bar at nights and flirts with the young ladies and tells jokes in Dutch, but he is also simultaneously the focal point of these ongoing traditions. And so when we did our work in preparation for the Aga Khan Award for Architecture ceremony, we performed all of these rituals, largely embodied, at least when it comes to the reconstruction, in the carpenter, priest, architect, who is simultaneously the workman who creates the physical fabric, renews the physical fabric, but also a priest and noble in the court of the palace. Which brings us to how could you draw that? One of the things I've been working with my students on is how to draw the operation of human bodies in architectural space. We look at Italian futurist painting, we look at Holly White's studies, how bodies invigorate space, and what is the relationship between architecture and the actions and bodies and humans and activities that architecture frames. The architect David Rockwell collaborated with the choreographer to try to find a way of notating these spaces. And of course, the political power of the body in space is something that has been effectively captured in film and video, not least of which is this documentation of power. And I say power deliberately to avoid the word politics, because this is something that transcends the petty machinations of politics that we were referring to in our conversation last night. But how do you capture the power of the human body in space? Partly it has to do with the larger setting. Certainly this framing of the events, Tiananmen Square, adds to the power. The raised eye point is crucial. Schindler's List, Spielberg uses the same raised eye level of Schindler and his wife looking down on the city, and the color coding of an otherwise black and white scene to document the spatial movement of one body in the midst of many bodies, and eventually becomes one of the most important icons of the film. And besides these highly charged moments in history, there is a day-to-day ritual of bodies in space that, and one of the contributions of Bourdieu is to help us see things that we would otherwise experience as invisible background realities, somehow natural. But the natural operation of bodies in the space of a market throughout much of the world is something that has been disrupted profoundly by the introduction of automobiles. And this is the work of photographer Martin Romer's documenting some of these interactions in space, trying to capture the motion of bodies in space in competition with automobiles. This is another attempt to capture it, a collaboration between William Forsythe, the famous dancer and choreographer, with the Ohio State University Computer Science Laboratory to develop new methods of capturing space, which actually, incorporating computer methods, have generated some quite intriguing work. One of my informants on this is a painter, choreographer, dancer who studied neuroscience and is now at MIT, who has very much looked at methods of these types of methods, but at the same time, the emerging neuroscience that indicates that the Cartesian split between mind and body is a false construct, that actually the body is part of all human experience, and that the body is not just something that gets our brains to meetings, although we might behave that way. Our brains are part of the body. They are an organ, and it is one mind-body system. And so the neuroscience coming out of the new brain scanning techniques, in a way, are confirming much of the aesthetic theory of the earlier time. And I just want to take another moment just to look at this one example that responds to the prospect of how, knowing what we know and knowing what we have learned from how memorials operate, how do we then do something besides simply memorialize, and there's nothing simple about it, but can we do something more proactively to use what we know about power and architecture and space to alter outcomes ahead of time. And so I showed this to my students, and we often say, very interesting building, but the situation matters, and the barriers to the human body make a difference. And so this takes me to Medellin, Colombia, where Manuel Delgado introduced me to a situation. Medellin is well known as the murder capital of the world, peaking in 1991 with 381 homicides per 100,000 people. The gains by the national military against the drug lords were followed up by this activist mayor who campaigned for mayor of Medellin by putting his body in space. He did not travel by bulletproof glass car. He walked through the neighborhoods of the city and won his victory. And when he won, he's the son of a famous architect, and he mobilized a team of architect planners who for many years had been developing proposals for what to do if they had the chance. And what they did is they mapped the dead bodies. They made a map of where all the dead bodies were piling up. And instead of building the state-of-the-art facilities and transportation system that had been planned for the wealthiest neighborhoods, they took those same plans off the shelf and they implemented them in the locations where the most bodies were piling up. And so this was ground zero for the death and destruction of the drug cartels. And they built a state-of-the-art library park and a cable car transportation system to connect this neighborhood to the rest of the city and society. And it's a tremendous transformation without replacing the housing. And it's more than a library and it's more than a park. It's really the center of a much larger campaign for education and retraining of the workforce to be productive members of society, so that the demobilized drug warriors with a fourth grade education, but they're very good at using the AK-47 that they brought back from the drug wars, did not turn to crime. Instead, they turned to new opportunities. The rivalries between different neighborhoods were brought together not by just this imposition of this infrastructure, but by the ground-up participation in the process of reconnecting the two neighborhoods. So now it's very much like a hill town in Italy. The buildings are quite simple, not much change, but transformed by the dignity granted by the architecture. And I think this speaks directly to Julian's challenge and presentation. It has become one of the tourist destinations of Latin America. The orange line is the murder rate in Medellin compared with other Colombian cities. The primary factor in the demobilization of the drug forces, the drug wars, were the military, but how to keep the crime and murder rate down as these drug warriors return to the cities. This is a museum of science, the public art by Botero downtown, and the openness of these library parks. 5 were built in the first term. A second mayor took over. We're in the third mayor now. But it's the connection between the neighborhood and these facilities, the bodily connection that allows the people to occupy these spaces, give them the dignity and the opportunity to establish local life without the dislocation of the new housing, making these two situations something more like night and day than any gradual subtle transformation. So I've gone over time, so I'm going to end it there. Thank you.
Can I'm interested, I'm sort of playing with an idea. I'd like to ask you both to comment on it. The idea of memory is, very important to both of the presentations that you gave. But I wonder how memory is expressed in professional terms for architects and urban planners, as, the role that it plays in sort of the professional standing, the professional ethic, in relation to the kinds of projects that you do. Because obviously, the other structures are built as well, and the other approaches to development are taken as well by professionals. And I'm interested, not knowing much about this, about how is there a battle over memory within sort of the professional standards that you're working with on projects like this, when you're confronting very different approaches to what should be in a place.
Well, I'll start with the example of the palace in Java, simply because it very literally presents two options: the colonial Williamsburg option versus something else. And I think we're going to hear later from Jeremy about the different values that can be embedded in different projects. And when I present this work to Hassan's class, I'm very explicit about Alois Riegel's identification of there's more than one way to preserve something, and you should look at what is important and then preserve or operate according to what is important. And so in those terms, I think it comes down very clearly to what is important is the presentation of a falsified cultural show more important than the value offered by an ongoing, unbroken, continuous tradition stretching over hundreds of years and into the present. And it is very, I think it's a very valuable example, and I continue to present it because it is so clear of exactly how you put it, these two options for how memory can come into play in what we do.
I would respond to your question from the ethical point, the ethical role that we can have in this awakeness of memory that does not necessarily is in the minds of the people, that may have been forgotten. And the fact, for example, that in Caracas, probably the population of Caracas forgot the possibilities of the use, the accessibility to the nature, the possibility that they can be reconnected, that the city can be a link instead of a fracture. The possibility that, and the example of Medellin that Robert brought is very interesting as well, because architectural intervention demonstrated the possibilities that community, society can be together in a place, and the role of the place, the quality of the place is very important. The quality of the design aspect is not only the social restoration or the economic development, it's also the expression that economic development and restoration can have in a space frame that is a mirror where the people can be looking at themselves. Yes.
So comment about the Medellin example with the mayor putting in the places right at the sites of violence. It raises an issue of sacrifice potentially, or of offering, not intentionally, but turning something that had been unintended and a product of violence against another group, rather than a sacrificial offering, to see something in a way that out of the worst situation we will make something higher than, even more than we even could have ever imagined. It seems like an interesting, very compelling human situation.
Well, in a way, I think that's very well put. In a way, it's the kind of response that we see from designers and others in response to natural and man-made disasters.
Yeah.
So one of the examples that I was going to show but didn't was the reconstruction efforts in Aceh, Sumatra after the tsunami. And the mantra there, one thing, there was a lot that divided us in terms of what the approach should be, but one thing that more or less united the people working on those efforts was the slogan, "Build Back Better." Is that out of the worst destruction, we can create something that is optimistic, forward-looking, and dramatically better for the people who have already suffered so much. I think similar ambitions are found in the early days after Haiti and all natural disasters. And so, in a way, this is a more localized version of that instinct that designers have. And I think as part of the ethical obligations of our profession, is very much embedded in who we are. We don't have a Hippocratic oath, but if we did, it would be something along these lines.
So that you painted a multi-pointed star. And this is.
Steve, I don't know.
I think you might need
I'm sorry.
a microphone. Why don't you pass that
I
mic?
just think that your series of examples is a series of extremes. At one end, Williamsburg. At the other end, Medellin.
Pretty good news.
But there's a part of the world that's inhabited by Levittown, which seems to me missing in the dialogue. Levittown is a kind of acknowledgement of a class of people who volunteered to serve and came back to a difficult situation. I'm using Levittown because it's the one that jumps into my head. But how do you think, both of you, how do you think the gray zone figures into this conversation?
Please.
After you, no, after you.
Go ahead, you first.
Well, between now and when Levittown experiences its disaster, I think in a much more day-to-day sense, and I tried to make this transition between Tiananmen Square, Schindler's List, and then straight to the spatial experience of cities throughout the world as they move from streets are for people, something we went through in the 1920s when there was a marketing agency developed the concept of jaywalking to make streets safe and legally reserved for automobiles. That was an effort, that was an initiative, and that occurred, and now it is playing out all over the world as the public space of the street is privatized by people displacing, and it has become a routine, it's become completely natural. And one thing that Bourdieu teaches us is as soon as it goes without saying, it probably deserves a second and third look. And Levittown, it went without saying at the time. I mean, the example of Levittown immediately makes me think about that which goes without saying in its original construction. Everyone was given an economic incentive to leave the cities and move to the suburbs. And I say everyone on purpose, as long as you're not black. There were restrictions, and this was not available unless you were white. And so the everyday, mundane, day-to-day reality of Levittown, under that surface of that which seems perfectly natural at the time, is something that is fundamentally unnatural, constructed, and profoundly harmful. And so what are, I think of the films of David Lynch, where suburbia is the bucolic setting for profound evil just below the surface. Blue Velvet, etc., that whole genre which some of us love. Partly because that which goes without saying is problematized to the great delight of movie-going audiences. I don't mean to trivialize it, but I think it helps to, and then Mad Men is another situation that goes without saying, is perfectly normal, but with the hindsight of several decades, all of a sudden, it's like, wait a minute, look at the roles that women play, look at how the men, so the Mad Men phenomena shows us something that we took for granted several decades ago. Is there a way that we can accelerate that way of seeing? Can we start to see those things instead of waiting 40 or 50 years in the case of Mad Men? Can we do it in 40 years or 30 years? Or can we see right now? Maybe the sudden shift of the gay marriage situation is a way that we made the connections quicker and seemingly more suddenly in historic time than we have in the past. So I don't know if that...
I wanted to add to, from the example of Caracas, I can say, trying to follow the trace of the city and trying to learn about the society in the case of Caracas. The society abandoned the center of the city because it was congested, because it was not working, and moved to the east in order to create this ideal society, suburban society. Abandoning the center got lost, it's completely ruined, and then the east of the city is totally congested now, and the city is completely packed. So rescuing the memories. First, nature, of course. The second, the urban life. The idea that the city can be reconnected, can be linked, and the traces of the city can be the opportunity for the people to be together again. This is as I would see it.
Julian, you had something? And then
No, I think it was
Jeremy? Sorry.
Yeah, I have a comment and then a question. So it struck me that the example that you gave, the work you did in the Javanized palace, is sort of maybe framed in a different way through like authenticity. Either you can observe the authenticity of the fabric, or in a case of the direction you went in, authenticity of meaning. So there's still authenticity being dealt with there, and I think it's kind of a useful way to reframe how we decide treatment for historic environments. The question I had is, I found it very interesting that in both of the studies that you presented, they both involve favelas or slums in some sort of way. Is there something about slums or the memories of slums that could actually influence or help how we deal with urban environments? Is there something we can learn from them that we can use?
Well, I think that it's become quite chic to look at slums as a source of not just disgust and lamentation, and actually without paying proper attention to the suffering, the very real suffering that occurs in slums, to see something instructive about emergence. Architecture is pathologically vision-oriented, as we've inherited it from the 20th century, but some of the most successful architectural visions are ones that acknowledge the operation of natural systems, the operation of human social dynamics, cultural formations that are less susceptible to top-down imposition, and you'd better work with these things rather than work against them. And so by the most successful top-down visions of the 21st century will be the ones that pay proper attention to natural occurrences in economic forces, especially as national and local governments face the reality that infinite growth is not going to fund debt spending in the present, so we'd better start to live within our own means. And so there's a huge financial advantage and incentive to start latching into these understandings of how emergent forces, such as those that are in evidence, the innovation of the, and we talk about slum dwellers less as peasant losers, and some people are actually pointing to these areas of informal settlements and saying, pay attention to this group. This is the dynamic movers and shakers that will be the next big, I don't like to use the word middle class because it portrays a false sense of geometry, but the consumer classes will come out of the favelas and the barrios and the whatever word you use from whatever part of the world you're in, because these are the movers and shakers who picked up, left, came to the city because of opportunity, and some people point to these areas as a sign of success, not failure.
Yeah, this question about the slums brings me to some reflection about, I think the societies, at least in Latin America, that I have examples close, lost a lot of time and wasted a lot of time trying to replace the slums by another type of architecture that never worked. Recently, I would say 20 years, from 20 years ago to now, the respect and the recognition that slums structures are possible to be good and actually are good in many cases, especially those, I have to talk in cases like Caracas, Rio de Janeiro, or Medellin, for example, where the topography helps. Sometimes helps, sometimes problematic because of the danger. This is the risky, the borderline where we're dealing with. But at least we're talking about slums that have air and views and some relation with the city that other cities don't have, like Mexico City, for example, where the flat areas of the valley of the big esplanade of Mexico expands infinitely in terms of slums that are equal and don't give the authenticity of a human urban space that can be recognized. One thing that is very nice when you know slums and go to places like informal settlements, that even though there are not places for big gatherings, the sense of public space, the intimacy of public space reminds me, for example, the mosque, where you can have three people praying in a mosque. Well, 3 people meeting in a small space in a slum is a very important place. The main problem is services, of course, and the need of more open space and the relationship with the possibilities of nature and the close approach to transportation to allow people to move easier. Those are the main problems. But that has to be solved. In terms of the housing, the people can build their own houses, and that has been demonstrated.
Julian?
Thank you
Make
very
this the
much.
last one or two questions.
Thanks for the presentations, and I wanted to echo some of the points that came forward. I was struck by the bringing back memories of Nelson Goodman, work, especially the work that the book Ways of World Making, and he talks about this sort of notion that part of our work has to do with kind of reconnection and recomposition of things that have already been done somehow. So there is a sense of the question of the authenticity is where is the origin of the authentic in a certain way. And I think what we saw before from Renato's presentation in terms of this searching for the traces of those moments in which the first stone was laid on the ground, to Java, or to the kind of transforming the kind of void in the city into something that is different, I think is very significant. Significant ways in which memory, going back, and this is where the question that I'd like to formulate goes, is this notion of the bodily experience and how that can become sort of sensuality, the kind of physicalness, the haptic, conditions are part of what we do. And I want to preface the question because I'd like for you, if you can expand a little bit more on this idea of the presencia that you mentioned. But I'd like to frame that in one word that Walter Benjamin suggested long time ago, which says that architecture's mystery and power relies on the fact that, as he would say, represents a form of art, the reception of which is done in state of distractness. The power of architecture relies in the fact that it's a form of art, the reception of which is done in state of distractness. And that, in a certain way, calls much attention to this notion that the building needs to be seen. Because in a certain way, it's not the case. At least what Benjamin is suggesting is actually the power of space relies on the fact that it's not about visuality, which you try, clearly to demonstrate in the kind of the animations, let's say, of the lighting, you know, in the kind of corridor. But maybe if you can expand a little bit more on this idea of the presence, you know, the body, because I think it's very powerful.
Well, I think you stated it quite well. Myself struggle with the connection between presencia, which in the literature of pilgrimage and religious pilgrimage, it's highly mystified and it's highly mystical, and it does seem to have something to do with breathing the same air that the Shroud of Turin or well, that's sealed now, but you know, whatever relic that it's there and I'm here and there's something mystically charged about this. And I almost don't want to make that connection because just as I don't like, there's also a connection to be made with phenomenology in all of this, but I don't think, especially with my students, it's good to introduce that kind of writing and thinking because it is too dependent on these mystical, ontologically, you accept them because they are. And I think that disempowers us to really reach a deeper understanding. I'm much more interested in the resonance between emerging neuroscience about how we experience things as not a disembodied mind, but as an embodied mind-body system, and you can't get away from that. It mediates every experience we have. And I think Renata's description of the kinesthetic experience, we don't see things in a frontal frame view, we experience things by moving through them. And that's a lot of the effort of how to use video, how to use computer animation and other tools to capture that relationship and take the measure in the best tradition of architectural drawing. How do you take the measure of that embodied experience of space? Because we have new tools and new understandings that allow us to do that, and I'm trying to mobilize an army of students to help explore that territory. And I think the best tools for that are more specific language that comes back to architecture. How do you translate what we experience into drawing, which is what we've always done for hundreds of years. It's just we have new tools of translation. We need new ways of thinking that will help us with that act of translation too.
Renata?
Well, I have essentially a question and a comment. I say it's the comment first.
Would you?
So in this little experiment that I did, the problem is that the more tools you have to be careful that you're not sort of using a hammer on a fly, so to speak, because every tool creates its own problems. And so and yet, when you're actually dealing with the question of making models for students of the best architecture, how do you present it? The minute that you do this, you only have so many tools to present this particular space or building, utilizing these tools or these tools. And and of course we live now, so any representation of a historic monument is already a reconstruction, and this is where you're constantly in this no-win solution, or else you can just say, okay, let's just be metaphoric about the whole thing. But putting pressure on this question of, well, all right, so you experience it bodily, so that means that for me to teach the Mosque of Cordoba and its history, we all have to go there. But no, because in fact, if we go there and it's completely lit up by fluorescence, it's might as well just stay at Penn. And so on it goes, and so I think that these are key issues to constantly be alert to, and utilize whatever experiment. Simply, this was just an experiment, but every single student that was in this experiment is now fully alive to these problems of, the nature of lighting, the nature of, and yet I still don't know whether my first comment on whether Al-Hakam invented the polylobe screen or not, and it was a memory trick. To be sure, subsequently, when it was repeated, nobody repeated that. And so I don't know, but it's my idea. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So the haptic aspect, I think, is one that we need to look at more.
I would say that thank you for your comments, and let's go for lunch. Maya, and then we will come back in a minute.
Since
But
I'm
Maya's
a
got
captive
something.
audience, I just wanted to, because I can't stay this afternoon, I'm going to come and have lunch with you, but I have to go to my other life. But because of memory that we've been talking about, I want to send you home with mementos. Does that work? Memory. Roger Williams University is celebrating, along with the governor's office and other organizations around the state, the 350th anniversary of the Rhode Island Colonial Charter. And to commemorate that, one of the things we've done is prepare a set of boxed cards. And I would just like you to take a set of them home with you when you leave. They'll be in the lunch in the gallery. And we also have our recent edition of the Roger Williams University magazine, which is really quite good. And I'd love for you all to take one home with you, or two, and read it and share it and just stay in touch. It was really wonderful meeting all of you. And I hope we do this every single year for as long as we're around. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.